It was just a wonderful script, but I had no idea that it was going to have the ongoing impact that it did until I got a note from the company that produced that show.
Somewhere in the CBS vaults, for more than 50 years, there sat a piece of film that the network refused to let anyone see. Not because it was lost, not because the negative had crumbled to dust. It was hidden on purpose, kept out of every rerun package, every syndication deal, every anniversary special, while the rest of a beloved television show played on television sets across the country for 5 straight decades. That single fact tells you something important. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a broadcaster can own isn't a weapon or a secret document. It's 48 minutes of black and white film that makes people uncomfortable. That show was The Twilight Zone, and the man behind it, Rod Serling, built an entire career out of smuggling difficult ideas past the people who were paid to keep television safe, cheerful, and inoffensive. Serling had fought in the Pacific during World War II as a paratrooper, and he came home changed by what he'd seen. When he tried to bring that honesty into network television, he ran straight into a wall of sponsors who didn't want anything on screen that might make an audience think too hard about the real world. His most famous fight came when he tried to adapt The Murder of Emmett Till into a teleplay. The story was gutted before it ever aired. The setting was changed, the racial context was scrubbed out, and by the time it reached viewers, it barely resembled what actually happened in Mississippi. Serling walked away from that experience, convinced that if he wanted to talk about racism, war, paranoia, and prejudice, he would have to disguise those subjects as something else entirely. Aliens, ghosts, haunted objects, small towns that weren't quite normal. If the censors thought they were approving harmless science fiction, they'd let almost anything through. For the most part, that strategy worked beautifully. The Twilight Zone ran for 5 seasons starting in 1959, won major awards, and is still remembered today as one of the smartest and strangest shows to ever air on network television. But a handful of episodes slipped past the sponsors during production and then ran straight into trouble after they aired. Trouble severe enough that 3 of them vanished from American screens for 20, 30, even 50 years. They weren't destroyed. They weren't officially banned by any government agency. They were simply removed, quietly, and kept out of circulation until the world was ready, or willing, to deal with what they contained. Here are those 3 episodes, why they disappeared, and what finally brought them back into the light. The Encounter. The first episode is the one most fans consider the true, banned episode of the entire series, because unlike the others, its removal had nothing to do with a lawsuit or a paperwork tangle. It was pulled because of what was actually on screen. The Encounter aired on May 1st, 1964, near the tail end of the show's 5th and final season. It was written by Martin M. Goldsmith rather than Serling himself, though Serling still hosted and approved it for broadcast. The entire episode takes place inside one location, a cramped, sweltering attic belonging to a World War II veteran named Fenton, played by Neville Brand. Fenton is a bitter, heavy-drinking man who spends his days surrounded by old junk and older grudges. A young Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori, played by a pre-Star Trek George Takei, knocks on his door looking for gardening work. Fenton invites him up into the attic to share a beer, and what starts as an ordinary conversation between 2 Americans slowly turns into something far more volatile. The centerpiece of the episode is an old samurai sword sitting in the attic, one that Fenton claims he took off a Japanese soldier during combat. As the heat and the tension build, Fenton eventually admits that he didn't kill the soldier in a fair fight at all. The man was trying to surrender when Fenton took his life, and took the sword as a trophy. The blade carries an inscription that reads, roughly translated, "The sword will avenge me." And throughout the episode it seems to exert a strange pull over Takamori, almost willing him to pick it up. In turn, Takamori reveals his own family secret. His father, he says, betrayed the country by signaling to Japanese aircraft ahead of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The 2 men's buried resentments and half-suppressed racism boil over, and the episode ends in violence. When The Encounter aired in May of 1964, the reaction was immediate and harsh. Japanese-American viewers and advocacy groups were justifiably furious. The episode leaned on stereotypes about disloyalty and hidden treachery that echoed the exact propaganda that had been used 2 decades earlier to justify the forced internment of Japanese American citizens during the war, an internment that George Takei himself had actually lived through as a child, an experience he would spend much of his later life speaking openly about. Airing a story that implied Japanese Americans might secretly be spies, so soon after the government's own campaign of internment, struck many viewers as not just clumsy, but genuinely harmful, regardless of what the writers may have intended. CBS responded by quietly pulling the episode from syndication. It's often cited as the only original episode of The Twilight Zone that was withheld from American reruns entirely, meaning that from the moment it first aired, an entire generation of fans who grew up watching the show in constant rotation never once saw the encounter on their television screens. For over 50 years, it existed mostly as a rumor among serious collectors, the one episode nobody could find. It finally returned to American television on January 1st, 2016, when the Sci-Fi Network aired it as part of a New Year's Day marathon, and it has since become available on streaming platforms alongside the rest of the series. Watching it today, the episode plays less like a forgotten curiosity and more like an uncomfortable time capsule, a reminder of how recently American television was still working through the raw nerve of the internment era, and how badly this particular attempt at addressing it went. The second lost episode has a very different story behind it. There's no controversy over its content, no advocacy groups demanding it be pulled, no accusations of harmful stereotypes. Instead, Miniature disappeared for 2 decades because of a lawsuit, and it remains one of the strangest legal sagas in the show's history. Miniature aired on February 21st, 1963, during the show's 4th season, the one season where every episode ran a full hour instead of the usual half hour. It was written by Charles Beaumont, one of the show's most gifted regular contributors, and it starred a young Robert Duvall, years before The Godfather or Apocalypse Now made him a household name, in the role of Charlie Parks. Charlie is a lonely, socially awkward man in his 30s who still lives with his mother, has no real friends, and has just lost his job for failing to fit in with his co-workers. Looking for somewhere to escape the pressures of ordinary life, he wanders into a local museum and becomes fixated on an elaborate 19th century dollhouse. Inside it sits a tiny porcelain figure of a woman, and Charlie begins to believe, or convince himself, that she is genuinely alive, that she plays her miniature piano, moves through her miniature rooms, and exists as a real, private companion meant only for him. His family and the museum staff naturally think he's losing his grip on reality. He's caught talking to the display case, bringing it small gifts, treating a doll as if she were his soulmate. Eventually, after an incident where he smashes the glass to save her from a threat only he perceives, Charlie is sent away for psychiatric treatment. The episode's ending is deliberately ambiguous, rather than the tidy fantasy resolution you might expect. Charlie is eventually released, seemingly cured, and yet the story leaves just enough doubt about what's real and what isn't that audiences have argued about its true meaning for decades. Despite strong reviews and a genuinely striking performance from a then-unknown Duvall, Miniature never made it into the show's original syndication package. The reason was a copyright lawsuit filed by a writer named Clyde Ware, who claimed the story had been lifted from a script of his own called The 13th Mannequin, which he said he had previously submitted to the production. Whether or not the two stories actually resembled each other closely enough to justify the claim is still debated by television historians. Many who've compared the two note the similarities were thin at best, but that didn't matter much to CBS's lawyers. With litigation hanging over the episode at the exact moment the syndication package was being assembled, the network's simplest option was to leave Miniature out entirely rather than risk a drawn-out legal fight. Once it was left out, it essentially became unavailable to the public. It sat unaired for 21 years until 1984, when it finally resurfaced as part of a syndicated special celebrating the show's 25th anniversary, complete with an early experiment in colorizing the dollhouse sequences for the broadcast. Today it's viewed as one of the finest hours the series ever produced, and it's readily available on home video and streaming. Proof that sometimes a masterpiece gets buried not because anyone hated it, but because a lawyer somewhere thought it was safer in a filing cabinet than on the air. The third episode to vanish shares an almost identical fate to Miniature, right down to the type of legal trouble that caused it. But the story it tells couldn't be more different in tone, where the encounter is grim and Miniature is melancholy. Sounds and Silences plays almost like dark comedy, until its punishment for its central character turns genuinely unsettling. The episode aired on April 3rd, 1964, during the final season, and this time Rod Serling himself wrote it. It centers on a blustering, overbearing businessman named Roswell G. Flemington, played by John McGiver, who runs a company that manufactures model ships and is obsessed, almost pathologically, with noise. He blasts recordings of naval battles at deafening volume in his own living room, shouts every sentence he speaks, and treats silence itself as some kind of personal enemy. His wife, worn down after years of living with a man who can't seem to function without constant racket, finally leaves him. Shortly afterward, Flemington's world turns against him in the most fitting way imaginable. Every ordinary sound around him, a dripping faucet, a ticking clock, his own footsteps, becomes a deafening, physically painful assault on his senses. When he seeks medical help, the condition flips entirely, and he's plunged into absolute silence instead, unable to hear his own voice or heartbeat. The episode ends with Flemington institutionalized, begging doctors to make some kind of noise, a man undone by exactly the thing he once demanded from the world around him. Like Miniature, the reason Sounds and Silences disappeared had nothing to do with its content and everything to do with the courtroom. Years earlier, in 1961, an outside writer had submitted a script to the production called The Sound of Silence, built around a similar premise of a man who suddenly can't hear. Serling's team passed on it at the time, but when Sounds and Silences aired in 1964 with an unmistakably similar hook, the original writer sued for plagiarism. The case was eventually settled, with the writer receiving $3,500 in damages, but the timing was brutal. The lawsuit was still working its way through litigation at the exact moment CBS was putting together the syndication package for the whole series. Rather than risk further legal exposure, the network simply left the episode out, alongside Miniature, and another episode called A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain, which had run into its own separate legal dispute. Sounds and Silences aired exactly once in 1964 and then sat untouched in the vault for 2 decades, resurfacing in that same 1984 anniversary special that brought Miniature back to life. It's now considered a minor but memorable entry in the show's run, less prestigious than the series' most iconic hours, but a fascinating footnote in the story of how a handful of episodes fell through the cracks of television history for reasons that had nothing to do with quality and everything to do with paperwork. Put those 3 stories side by side, and a strange pattern emerges. The encounter disappeared because its subject matter genuinely offended people, and the network wanted to avoid the fallout. Miniature and Sounds and Silences disappeared for the far less dramatic reason that lawyers were nervous about lawsuits that happened to be pending at exactly the wrong moment. 2 very different categories of banned, bundled together in fan mythology as if they were the same kind of forbidden. And there's a 4th episode worth mentioning in the same breath, even though it isn't part of the official Big 3. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, a haunting, nearly wordless French short film that Serling licensed and aired as a Twilight Zone episode near the end of the series' run, purely to fill a slot and save money during a season plagued by budget problems. Because the show only paid for limited broadcast rights, the film had to be legally stripped out of the syndication package entirely once the series went into reruns, and for decades fans who'd caught its single original airing weren't sure whether they'd actually seen it or simply imagined it. What all of these stories share is a lesson about how fragile access to media used to be. Today, if a network wants to bury something, all it takes is one internet leak to undo that decision permanently. But in the 1960s and for decades afterward, a network genuinely could make a piece of film disappear from public view almost completely, simply by leaving it out of a syndication contract. No streaming platforms, no home recording culture strong enough to preserve a broadcast, no easy way for curious fans to track down a copy. The encounter existed as little more than a rumor for half a century. Miniature and Sounds and Silences were known quantities to serious collectors, but genuinely difficult for an average viewer to ever see. That kind of erasure is almost unthinkable now, which is part of why these episodes have taken on an almost mythical status among fans. They're relics of a time when a network truly did have the power to write something out of history, at least for a while. It's also worth noting, honestly, that none of these 3 episodes are actually banned anymore. Miniature and Sounds and Silences have been part of standard syndication and home video releases since the 1980s. The Encounter made its long-delayed return to American television in 2016 and is now streaming right alongside the rest of the series on Paramount+. The still banned framing makes for a good hook, but the more interesting truth is what these episodes reveal about the era that suppressed them in the first place. A television landscape where a single lawsuit or a single wave of public anger could make a story vanish for a generation, and where the reasons for that disappearance often say more about the anxieties of the time than about the episodes themselves. Rod Serling didn't live to see most of this vault reopened. He passed away in 1975, nearly a decade before Miniature and Sounds and Silences resurfaced, and more than 40 years before The Encounter finally aired again. But the show he built has outlasted every network executive and sponsor who ever tried to soften his stories, and the episodes that were once considered too risky to show are now studied as some of the most fascinating entries in the entire series. Not necessarily because they're the best episodes